Okay, the first section will concern medieval and Renaissance English poets. Now, this might sound odd to you because if you know anything about historical periods, you might say, well, the Middle Ages or the medieval period comes before the Renaissance. So why would I be talking about medieval poetry in this lecture? Well, partly it's because the terms medieval and Renaissance are not scientific terms, but they're kind of ideological slogans, or they're kind of metaphorical attempts to understand the past, and they're not very reliable. And in fact, the difference between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance is quite complicated. And in fact, there's tremendous continuity between the two periods. And there are all kinds of complicated traces of influence across the two domains. I think I'll try to show what I mean by that in a few moments. But on your screen now is a portrait of famous Italian poets from the Trecento, which is the 14th century, the 1300s. It's very confusing, but in Italian they would call that the Trecento. And here you have 6 poets, but the most important ones for our purposes are the ones in the middle. The one here is recognizable as Dante, the author of the Divine Comedy and other important works. To his over here we have Petrarch, another major figure, wearing the laurel crown. They're all wearing the laurel crown. And in the middle is Boccaccio. So these 3 poets here, but Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Dante, are what are called in Italian the 3 corone, or the 3 crowns of Italian literature, or of the Trecento, and they all had tremendous influence on late medieval and Renaissance English poets, and then many people after the English Renaissance as well. So the first English poet we should discuss would be Chaucer, who is really arguably the main conduit between Italian culture and English literature. Okay, so Chaucer was a late 14th century poet. The 3 crowns of the Trecento were all writing in the earlier 14th century, Dante being the earliest, then Petrarch, then Boccaccio. So Chaucer apparently was, he might have actually been the first English poet to read Italian literature in the actual Italian language. Obviously, many English writers would have read Latin works that might have been composed in Italy, right, by Italians, you might say. But as for the vernacular Italian language, it seems that Chaucer was, if not the earliest, surely one of the most early poets of England to take an interest in that work. And Italian poetry heavily influenced his own writings. So one example would be his poem, The Parliament of Fowls. Now, Dante was most famous, as you might know, for the Divine Comedy, which is the story of the poet's journey first to hell, then up the mountain of purgatory, and finally he goes into heaven, and he flies through the various spheres of heaven till he reaches the top of heaven, and he has a vision of God, the Christian God, and then he faints, basically, and the poem ends. And Dante takes himself extraordinarily seriously. One of my teachers would say he actually considered the Divine Comedy the Third Testament. So you have the Jewish Bible, then the so-called New Testament, and then Dante thought of his own Divine Comedy as the Third Testament, a kind of continuation of the scriptures, Christian scriptures. And so he's extremely ambitious, and he's a visionary poet. Chaucer is much more modest and self-effacing and ironic. And his poems, at least his Dante-esque poems, are much shorter than Dante's. One of them is The Parliament of Fowls. Now, one of the most famous scenes in Dante is the Gateway of Hell, which has an inscription written on it. It's very famous. And Chaucer's Parliament of Fowls also includes a scene in which the main character, who's a sort of version of Chaucer himself, is walking in front of a gate, and there are not one but two different inscriptions on the gate, and he's not sure whether he should go inside of the gate or whatever. And finally, his guide, who is the philosopher, well, the Roman general Scipio, pushes him into the gate because he can't decide for himself. Now, this is a kind of parody of Dante, because Dante, when he journeys to hell, he has a guide. The guide is the Roman poet Virgil, and Virgil explains what's going on, and he scolds Dante when Dante makes mistakes or when Dante misunderstands things. And Virgil also explains like the architecture of hell, the science of hell, all the, he rationalizes hell, basically. And then that proceeds into purgatory. And eventually when he goes into heaven, Dante goes into heaven, his guide, Virgil, is replaced by Beatrice, who is the woman that he loved in Firenze. So Chaucer gives a kind of funny version of Dante in the Parliament of Fowls that makes fun of certain elements of Dante's work. This is quite interesting because although Chaucer obviously admires Dante and learned many things from him, Chaucer also has a kind of critical perspective on Dante, and he could be read as making fun of some of the more pretentious and grandiose, some might even say heretical, elements of Dante's divine vision. A similar work by Chaucer, which does something along those lines, is The House of Fame, another visionary poem in which Chaucer, or a version of Chaucer, has a dream, and in the dream, an eagle grabs him from the ground and takes him into the sky. And this eagle is a talking eagle, and the eagle is a kind of, again, a parody of Dante's Virgil, and the eagle explains various scientific things to Chaucer. It's just supposed to be funny, I think. And eventually takes Chaucer into the sky, into this palace in the sky called the House of Fame, which in some ways is similar to what happens to Dante when he goes to hell, and also when he goes to paradise or heaven. So that's another Dante-esque or Dante-inspired text by Chaucer. But perhaps the most important influence of Dante on Chaucer is the hendecasyllable line. Hendecasyllable is the standard or most common poetic line or meter in classical Italian poetry. And that's true of Dante, but also Boccaccio and Petrarch and many poets after them. Hendecasyllable is a little bit complicated to explain, but basically it's a syllable, it's a line with 10 syllables. Well, not always 10. There's a line with syllables, of course, and there's always a stress on the 10th syllable. And sometimes there's an extra unstressed syllable after the 10th syllable, which will often give you an 11-syllable line, hence the name hendecasyllable. Now, Chaucer, probably the most important thing that he did was he developed the iambic pentameter meter. Before Chaucer, in English, the most common metrical form was probably octosyllabic couplets, which is sort of like a tetrameter, 4-beat line. And Chaucer's House of Fame is written in that 4-beat line, but then he switched to iambic pentameter to write most of his major works, including most of the Canterbury Tales and also various other things, including the Parliament of Fowls. Many people have wondered, well, why did he devise this meter, or why did he develop this meter? And I think one of the most persuasive explanations is that it's actually an adaptation of the Italian hendecasyllable. So sometimes you hear people say things like, iambic pentameter is the perfect meter for English poetry because it completely it perfectly matches the essence of the English language. Or they'll make some kind of organic argument that iambic pentameter just is sort of a natural meter to use in English. But that seems to me, I'm not persuaded by that. And I actually think it might have nothing to do with the essential nature of English language. In fact, it might just be an Italian import, which is quite ironic. The most English of meters might actually be something that derives from Italian. So here is an example from early in Dante's Divine Comedy, Mi ritrovai in una selva oscura. Typically, you're going to have, in the hendecasyllable, you're going to have a stress on the 4th syllable and the 10th syllable. But the other syllables, there's no particular stress pattern that is enforced or required. But in the classic iambic pentameter line, like this line from the Parliament of Fowls, we have an alternation of unstressed and stressed syllables, the leaf so short, the kraft so long to larna. Okay, so not necessarily Dante, but Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio influenced not only the content of Chaucer's works, but maybe the development of their metrical form. And largely because of Chaucer's influence, the iambic pentameter became the standard meter for most what you might call mainstream English poetry for hundreds of years. Another poet that influenced Chaucer was Boccaccio, and Boccaccio influenced many of Chaucer's works. In fact, many of Chaucer's works are basically translations of Boccaccio's texts. Very loose translations, or you might want to call them adaptations, but often they're clearly working directly from a preceding Italian text by Boccaccio. One of them is the Filostrato, which is a story about the Trojan War, but actually it's a love story about two lovers, and it uses the conventions of medieval courtly love literature, but it inserts those conventions into the Homeric story of the Trojan War. And Chaucer took Boccaccio's Filostrato and created a very different text, Troilus and Chryside, one of his longest and most influential poems. Another example would be Boccaccio's Teseida, which is a story about the House of Thebes, the ancient Greek House of Thebes, which is a story of war, civil war, murder, and it's really a horrible story, full of bloodshed and strange twists of fate. The most famous character from the House of Thebes would be Oedipus, right? And so Boccaccio wrote a very long poem called the Teseida, based on actually a Latin poem by Statius, and Chaucer translated or adapted part of Boccaccio's Teseida to create the Knight's Tale, it's the first of the Canterbury Tales. Another example is Chaucer's Franklin's Tale, which is an adaptation probably of Boccaccio, of a story included in Boccaccio's Il Filocolo. And Boccaccio, like Dante and like Petrarch, not only wrote in Italian, but he also wrote in Latin. And he has a very long poem. Well, I can't remember if it's a poem, but it's in Latin. It's called De Casibus Virorum Illustrium, concerning the falls of famous men. And Chaucer used the basic idea of that long poem. Basically, it's a series of miniature tragedies, not a full-length drama, but a series of short, almost encyclopedia article size, short narratives about tragic falls of glorious kings and other famous characters as they meet their demise. And that becomes Chaucer's collection of miniature tragedies called The Monk's Tale. This is also very important because in the 15th century, there is a poet you may never have heard of called John Lydgate, who was inspired by Chaucer's Monk's Tale to translate the entire text of Boccaccio's De Casibus, and he produced a very, very long poem, one of the longest poems in English language, called The Fall of Princes, which almost nobody reads nowadays, but it was very, very influential in the 15th and early 16th century. And then in the 16th century, various poets did a continuation of The Fall of Princes, which was called The Mirror for Magistrates, or The Mirror of Magistrates, I can't remember. And that was very influential on Elizabethan tragedy, including people like Shakespeare. Petrarch, or Petrarca, also influenced Chaucer in various ways. I should have said that perhaps the biggest influence of Boccaccio on Chaucer was his text, the Decameron, which is a collection of 100 stories, which probably was the main prototype, or the main precursor for Chaucer's collection of stories, the Canterbury Tales. Although in the past, critics were skeptical about that, I think more and more critics seem to think that Boccaccio did, in fact, influence the Canterbury Tales with his Decameron. But there's a particularly interesting example of this, which is Chaucer's Clerk's Tale, which is a translation of Petrarch's Epistolae Seniles 17.3, which is itself a translation of Boccaccio's Decameron 10.10. So the last story in Boccaccio's Decameron is written in Italian. It's the story of Decameron 10.10, which is a story about basically a paranoid and sadistic husband who torments his humble wife for years. Okay, it's a very odd story. Then Petrarch takes that story and he translates it into Latin prose, and he makes all kinds of interesting changes to it. And then Chaucer comes along, he takes Petrarch's story in Latin prose and he translates it into English poetry. So in reading Chaucer's version, you have this very complicated series of textual levels. You got Petrarch's text. So Chaucer is in dialogue with Petrarch, but Petrarch's text itself is in dialogue with the Decameron. And there's also a kind of political element to this, because Boccaccio is writing in Firenze, which was a republic. It was not a monarchy. Petrarch is writing under the patronage of the Visconti in northern Italy, which was a kind of dictatorship. And so some critics would say that Petrarch is basically rewriting Boccaccio's Republican text to make it more patriarchal and more in line with the authoritarian values of the Visconti dictatorship. And then Chaucer, in a way, rewriting Petrarch, he's also performing a very complicated political meditation on England's political relationship, both to the Visconti dictatorship and Boccaccio's own Republican values. Chaucer was also a diplomat as well as a poet, so he was intimately involved in these political concerns. Also, Petrarch, in the Renaissance and in the early modern period, Petrarch was probably most famous as a writer of Latin prose. And one of the things that the so-called Renaissance achieved was attempt to recreate the Latin language as it was actually written by the ancient Romans. The idea was, I think this is an idea that almost no linguist nowadays would take seriously, but the idea was that medieval Latin was a degraded or barbaric version of the originally wonderful Latin of the ancient Romans. So many Renaissance scholars attempt to reconstruct the original, supposedly superior Latin of the ancient Romans, and Petrarch was one of the earliest members of this humanist movement. So he wrote many works in what are considered to be exquisite Latin prose, including his version of Boccaccio's Decameron 10.10. But he's much more famous nowadays for his Italian poems, especially for his sonnets. And I'll say more about the sonnets in a few moments, but Chaucer was probably the first person in England to translate a Petrarchan sonnet, and he inserts it into his poem Troilus and Chryside. So the S'amor non è che dunque è quel ch'io sento is the sonnet in question, although Chaucer does not translate the sonnet form, he only translates the content and he uses his own stanzaic form. But that's an important moment in the history of the English adaptation of the sonnet form. And that takes us to the 16th century or the 1500s, in which many poets developed the example of Petrarch's sonnets. One of the famous early examples was the poet Thomas Wyatt, and he wrote several sonnets that are basically translations or adaptations of particular Petrarch sonnets. And here's one example where you can see on the left-hand column the original Italian text by Petrarch, and on the right-hand column you can see Wyatt's English version of the poem. Now, probably the most important thing to consider about the sonnet form is the rhyme pattern. So in Petrarch, it's A, B, B, A. Okay, so oblio rhymes with mio, verno rhymes with governo. Okay, then that pattern repeats in the next stanza. And then the last two stanzas have a new pattern, C, D, E, C, D, E. So sdegni rhymes with segni, sarte rhymes with l'arte, a torto rhymes with porto. And Wyatt does a similar thing here, although he changes the order slightly in the last two stanzas. But basically, he is adapting the Petrarch sonnet form. Then later poets like Shakespeare, Philip Sidney, Edmund Spenser, and John Milton, and many more wrote their own versions of sonnets, and sometimes they tinkered with the rhyme patterns more than Wyatt did. Now, I've already mentioned the three crowns of the Trecento, Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, but there are many other influential Italian poets whom we should consider, and I will consider in this lecture. Now, toward the end of this lecture, I'll talk more about the painters. One interesting tendency I noticed in writing this lecture, although I never thought about it before, is that early on, it seems it's really the poets who are the most influential on English literature. But as time goes by, the influence of the poets seems to recede somewhat, and the painters seem to be more dominant. We'll talk more about the painters later, but two other poets you should be familiar with are Ariosto and Tasso, Italian poets of the 16th century. Ariosto wrote, well, his most famous work is the Orlando Furioso, which is about the ancient French hero Roland, but actually it's embroidered with many, many complicated stories in the style of Arthurian literature or medieval romances, but it's also written in a semi-humorous way. Tasso is a much more serious poet, and he wrote various poems, long narrative poems, including one about one of the Crusades. Okay, so both of these poets were very influential on Spenser, who was a late 16th century poet who wrote in many different poetic genres and forms. He wrote sonnets in the Petrarchan tradition. Petrarchan tradition consists not only of the formal rules for a sonnet, such as the rhyme pattern or the rhyme scheme, but it also includes a series of conventions. Usually it's well, almost always is a heterosexual relationship described in the sonnet. The sonnet is usually about the theme of love. Usually a man loves a woman, and the woman is usually represented as a very pale woman with golden hair and various other stereotypical features, and a kind of aesthetic and moral perfection that the poet cannot quite deserve or obtain. These are some of the conventions of the Petrarchan tradition, which saturates 16th century English poetry. And Spenser wrote sonnets in this tradition, although he developed his own rhyme pattern, different from Petrarch's. In fact, we already mentioned Wyatt's adaptation of Petrarch's Passa la Nave, and Edmund Spenser has his own version of the same Petrarch sonnet called Amoretti 34 from his collection of sonnets called Amoretti. So you can read Petrarch's poem, then compare it to Wyatt's poem, then compare it to Spenser's poem, and you have three versions of the same text, basically. Another famous Spenser poem is Epithalamion. I think it was written in celebration of his own marriage, but it's an English adaptation of Petrarch's canzone form, which is a long, complicated poetic form that Spenser, it's a technically difficult form that Spenser masterfully adapts in his Epithalamion. But Spenser is best known for his enormous allegorical romantic epic, The Faerie Queen. And here, the influence of Ariosto and Tasso becomes very important. So in his kind of introductory text explaining the Faerie Queen, his letter to Walter Raleigh, Spenser claims that the purpose of the Faerie Queen is to fashion a gentleman or noble person. So it has the goal of the text is ethical, not aesthetic, or even necessarily political, at least in the, at first. The primary goal is ethical, to fashion a gentleman or noble person, to morally influence somebody so that they become a gentleman. To achieve this goal, he has followed the antique poets, historical, first Homer, then Virgil, after him Ariosto, and lastly Tasso. So the great epics of antiquity, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, are the primary models, but he adds to that tradition Ariosto's Orlando Furioso and the narrative poems of Tasso. And in the various parts of the Faerie Queen are the stories are heavily influenced by Ariosto and Tasso. So in fact, if you want to understand the Faerie Queen, it's a very good idea to read some Ariosto and Tasso. And here is an image from the Orlando Furioso. This is from the 19th century French illustrator Gustave Doré. And this is a famous scene in which the hero Ruggiero, or Roger, riding a winged horse, kills a sea monster that is attacking Angelica, a woman who is chained to a rock. Okay, that's this image, and this story will reappear later in the lecture, I think.